adding soul to the message. As we've dealt with a once-in-a-century pandemic, many people believe that the message of healthcare has missed the mark to the Black community. Is it the message or the messenger? And as we end Black History Month, we'll discuss why it's important that we still celebrate Black History Month itself, our accomplishments, and we have so much further to go. This is Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville, and we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. You're listening to State of Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. We want to thank you for joining us again on this Sunday afternoon. If you've been listening throughout this entire Black History Month, you'll know that we've been discussing the Black church with our partnership with PBS and WHRO in conjunction with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It was a tremendous success. You can go back on the website of PBS and you can view that series by the historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. Today, we want to take a look at not just, we're going to combine a couple of things here. We're going to take a look at how Black preachers and African-American rhetoric adds to the message and how we get information out to the community. Now, keep in mind, with the Black church, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about social justice. We talked about economics. We talked about even just building ourselves up through education. But we're going to take a look at it from a different aspect, especially with us dealing with the healthcare crisis. And joining us today, we have a very good friend of mine. He's no stranger to Hampton Roads. His name is Dr. Will LaVeist. Dr. LaVeist, thank you so much for joining us.
Dr. Claville, always a pleasure, my friend. Always a pleasure to be with you, man.
Now, again, like I said, you're no stranger to Hampton Roads. You and I, we actually we have a project together that we're doing called LaVeist and Claville. You can find
Absolutely.
it. Yeah, you can find it. It's a podcast. It's a radio show, and we do a lot of interesting things together on that particular piece. We'll talk about it more at the end of the show, where people can follow us. And I want you to talk a little bit more about that project. But tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your time here in Hampton Roads.
Well, it's been a minute. I initially came to Hampton Roads as a columnist for the Hampton Roads Daily Press. I was the first Black Metro columnist. This is back in, the early 2000s.
Oh, wow.
And then I was recruited to go back to Chicago to Ebony Magazine, and then I was recruited to come back to the Virginian Pilot to lead Mix Magazine, which was a venture startup, the first multicultural publication in Virginia. And around that time, I also began my radio show. Actually, they were talking to me at Hampton at one of your sister stations or friendly stations across the water, WHOV. They had been talking to me about doing a radio show when I was a columnist initially, but when I came back, we regrouped that idea, and that's actually when you and I connected. And so, we
Absolutely.
missed that vibe that we had on the radio and communicating with each other and chopping it up. So yeah, Hampton Roads is definitely a second home. Originally a New Yorker, but Hampton Roads is definitely a second home, and my time as a columnist there and as a writer has been rich and fulfilling. So definitely.
Absolutely. And, we've talked about on our project, our podcast, about HBCUs and the reason why we love HBCUs, and you're a product of Lincoln University.
Absolutely. The Lincoln University of Pennsylvania, the great state of Pennsylvania, the first HBCU.
And again, don't mistake it with Lincoln University in Missouri, right? But this is
right,
the one
which I have love for. We love them as well, but they're not the Lincoln University of Pennsylvania.
Well, look, we're so glad to have you join us here at Norfolk State University, WNSB. Stay of the Water, where we deal with issues and we bring community leaders, policymakers, movers and shakers to the community to talk about very important issues that's important to them from an African-American perspective. And today, I want to talk about this concept that you've actually created in part, with your academic work calling adding soul to the message. Tell us where that idea came from.
Well, yes, it's part of my dissertation. I'm a proud now ODU monarch. I earned my doctorate at ODU, focusing on technology and media studies in the English department. And my dissertation was very much about my passion for the black community and health, particularly as a reporter. And then as a columnist over the course of my years, I became more and more interested in health. And so also being a believer, being a man of faith, I was actually an ordained deacon back in the 90s. I know very much about how critical the black church has been to the development of black culture, period. And so the black church is at the root, from the spirituals to the black folk church tradition to move to all of the development, all the various denominations. That's at the root of our culture as Afro-Americans. I say Afro because we are the people of Africa, like our cousins throughout the hemisphere, whose ancestors made it through that Middle Passage. So in my dissertation, I wanted to look at, if you're going to deliver a message that's going to be effective to a particular people, one of the things you can look at is their own literary traditions and adopt those and use that as a way of forming the message. And so I looked at the African-American Jeremiad literary form, which is a unique form of the American Jeremiad literary form, and how that could be applied to health messaging. Right. And that Jeremiad form, we as people who have been in the church, we're very familiar with hearing it. We've heard it in various different forms. We hear it in church, but it's also been used and played out in other arenas. So if you've heard Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream speech, or any of his speeches, quite frankly, he used that form. Now,
Will, before we go any further, I want people to understand that we're talking about, when you talk about the Jeremiah style of preaching and messaging, we're not talking about Jeremiah Wright in Chicago, the former pastor of former President Obama and Michelle Obama, but we're talking about the prophet Jeremiah, right?
Right. Okay. Well, yes and no, because you're correct that where it comes from the prophet Jeremiah, who you see in the Hebrew text was lamenting of the people for their turning away from God.
Right.
And so it is that that's exactly what it is that it's this lament of woe, of letting the people know of the risk of turning away from God and not repenting. And so the American form offers that same kind of woe, but it has at its root this hope that eventually people will turn around and repent. And so when you talk about the prophet, you talk about the prophet Jeremiah, and then you talk about Jeremiah Wright. Well, Jeremiah Wright preached in that tradition of the African-American form, where you hear him lamenting and talking about the grievances that America has done, the wrongs that America has done. But in the end, he always came with that sense of hope in the African-American tradition and our patriotism and our promise, our belief that the country will still do right by us. And so he's absolutely one of the last to preach in that African-American tradition, Jeremiad form. Absolutely.
Now, we're talking about adding soul to the message, and I want to connect that to healthcare. Now, we know that you and your brother, Dr. Thomas LaVeist, who's also the Dean of Public Health, the School of Public Health at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana, my home state. There's a project you guys are working on as it relates to the skin you're in, is communicating issues to the black community so that they can understand it about their health. We're dealing with COVID-19, right? And the messages have been out there that the African-American community have not been targeted properly. They're not getting the information that they should. And a lot of times we see people that are talking to African-Americans are really talking at African-Americans, right?
Exactly.
And as opposed to meeting the citizens or the patients right where they are. So how can, this concept that you have is very interesting. How can the Jeremiah type of preaching or messaging help get the message of healthcare and that message of of healthcare, vaccines, how to take care of yourself to the African American community more effectively?
Glad you asked that, because that's exactly what my dissertation did. I appreciate you mentioning the project, tsyi.org, or the skin you're in. The website was designed and constructed in that format, in the Jeremiad format, with the movements, because, again, the concept being, if people of this particular group, in this case African Americans, see the messaging coming to them in a form that instinctively is familiar to them, then they will be more receptive and actually engage in behavior change. And so you're right, a lot of times when it comes to messaging to our community, oftentimes the people constructing the messages are not black or do not understand the community. Mm-hmm. So they'll do some logical things like say, well, let's go to the church or let's go to the barbershop. But the messaging is still oftentimes, like you said, it's still not endemic to that culture. So you're talking at the people. And so what we looked at is to say you construct the message in a way that is familiar to these people, so it deals with the issues that we're most concerned about. So the four movements in it is you give an affirmation of the promise, right? The movements in the Jeremiad is that, God promised his people certain things. So you give an affirmation of the promise. You recognize that, people have turned away from the promise. And then you say, well, if you need to repent or else we will be doomed. Well, the American Jeremiad adds, you need to repent, and then we will repent because God has intended us to be a greater people. What the African American piece does is it acknowledges racism. It says, white America, you will never and we will never become a great country unless you do right by us. So when you message to African Americans around health, you have to think of those same movements, the sense of community, the sense of there's outside forces that's creating this health crisis, the racism. That has been totally exposed through COVID. Yeah. That we got systemic racism that is still in play, that is plaguing our community. And that is what is the reasons why these disparities and these health conditions exist.
But Will,
and then here's what we can do to turn it around and to become a better people.
But Will, you said it's been exposed, right? Now, to African Americans and also to medical professionals, they've always known that these inequities have been there. They've always known that there are the haves and the have-nots. There have always been that as it relates to access to and health care. And I think the message, this is me, I think the message during the Affordable Care Act and that negotiation going back and forth missed the mark. I think it was about health care insurance, which is a money thing, as opposed to access to health care, right? So we've always known it was there, but, how is it that the public did not really grasp, that those inequities were there?
Well, because that's the history of African Americans in this country, that there's the country's denial of the conditions of which it has put people of African descent in. And so as long as you don't ever effectively deal with that reality, then you just going about your business in denial. Then you move into other areas of blaming a victim, of shifting the blame to something else.
Right.
But what we're seeing now and what we're being confronted with is that the remnants of slavery, of the black codes, of legal segregation still very much remain. We are a segregated society. We have systemic racism. You must address that if you want to have change. And then there's also, in our tradition, there's also been a sense of self-empowerment, self-reliance. That's also a part of the African-American Jeremiad tradition. So, but it's got to be, self-reliance has got to come with the recognition of the systemic racism and the attack that we continue to be under. It's not one or the other, it's both.
Look, you talked about Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, and others the Black Panther movement, and so forth. So, I mean, that's a lot to unpackage. But you listen to State of the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. Today we have Dr. Will LaVeist, and we're talking about adding soul to the message and how that the messaging during COVID-19 and healthcare has missed the mark in the African American community. Is it the message or is it the messenger? 757-823-9110. Let us know if you have something that you would like to ask. Will, you mentioned that, COVID-19 has exposed these inequities. And I'm asking a question, is it the message or is it the messenger? So in your opinion, your expert opinion, during this time period of communicating both the dangers of COVID, communicating the research around COVID-19, the research around vaccination, and the research around side effects and the research around wearing masks and social distancing, where did we miss the mark in communicating this more specifically to African Americans? Or did we?
Well, I think a lot of the messaging that's going out is challenged by a lot of the disinformation that is also going on. And that's why my dissertation focused on the online and my research looks at online, because what you have going on in the internet space is there's so much misinformation. It's so easy for people to pass on misinformation that people get to a point where they don't know what to believe.
Yeah.
So what you have is that challenge, unlike, previous generations where the messaging was coming from some particular directions, the press, the airwaves, like shows like these, or television. Right now online is the word of mouth that exists in the community. In the physical community, it's another extension of that, and it's actually that word of mouth in your community.
Yeah.
Particularly for African Americans, that's most strongest in convincing people to engage in behavior change. It's not really what they see on TV. It's not really what we hear on the radio so much, but it's what we hear from our neighbors right in the community, in barbershops, in churches, so forth. Word of mouth is still important. So that's the challenge, as I see it, is so much disinformation and misinformation that's being put out there by people who really don't have an interest for our community, such as the anti-vax movement,
right? Using
legitimate, distrust of government to actually steer people in a direction that's actually destructive. And again, that's what the Jeremiads of the past did. They didn't cut corners about whether government is distrustful. They say, yes, government is doing this to us, but still,
yeah,
we must, we must
take care of ourselves. That's right.
That's right. We must take care of ourselves, and we must believe in the promise, and that God will deliver us. Yet still, but we have a battle that's going on with people who would distract us from that.
Will, you and I, we've talked on our project, LaVeist and Claville, about this issue a lot. And, one thing that you brought up is that when you and your brother were creating the Skin You're In project as well, that you were talking to African Americans. You were talking to individuals in the barbershop, in the beauty shop, educated African Americans, right?
That's right.
And there was some information that they were saying that even I was shocked. When you revealed that information. Tell our audience a little bit about some of the misinformation that's going on in the African American community that you discovered during your project and research.
Well, for one, as it pertains to COVID, if you remember in the early stages, people were saying black people couldn't get it because they were black.
Yeah.
So black people couldn't get it. That's just a total misunderstanding of how biology works. And that argument actually feeds the lie of racism, because the bottom line is that there's only one human race, and we're all, regardless of our skin color, which is all about melanin level, we are biologically the same. So to say that black people can't get a disease is just crazy, and you're actually helping the argument of the racists who would say that black and white people are different. So that's one of the kinds of things that we discovered. Misunderstandings about diabetes, people calling it that sugar, and having an expectation that they would get diabetes, that is just part of being
life.
black.
Right.
That's just part of life.
Which is not.
You know, and it's like, no, it's absolutely not. If you eat a proper diet, if you are not doing the things that bring diabetes to bear, then you're not likely, you're not as likely to get it. So it's those types of things, just kind of accepting things as they are because we don't know. The other thing we found out, again, that you pointed out, is interviewing people on the ground in the neighborhood, is how they are experts in health and in their life and can tell you what is going on and why. And a lot of them had very much knowledge. They were pointing out the things like, why are there no fresh fruits in our communities?
Yeah.
Why do we have all these chicken spots? It's not that it's
processed
something
foods.
wrong. Yeah, why are all these processed
liquor
foods?
stores?
It's not that, exactly. So it's not like it's something wrong with a fried chicken spot in your neighborhood, but why are there such a plethora of those, but then there's not fresh fruits, there's not supermarkets where you can actually eat healthy foods? So these are the types of things that, folks in the neighborhood are experts in equal respect as the researchers, and that's how we presented it in the documentary as well.
In politics, we always say that you can always have a new leader or new elite, but you can never have a new grassroots. In other words, the foundation of your support of your organization is not going to change, as it relates to those ideas, the ideology, and the like. And I think that's one thing that we've forgotten as it relates to communicating to African Americans. Again, you mentioned the message and how, we're not getting the proper message out to the people. And I think it's also because of the messenger. Now, one thing that we've discussed and we've seen, and that the pandemic has also uncovered, is that when we're talking about African American or quote unquote people of color, right? That's the N word word now, where we talk about is inclusive of African Americans and non-African Americans, but anyone who's non-white, right? Or anyone who does not have access, to what money and education can give you. But the messengers to people of color have not often been African Americans.
Right.
It's been a lot of East Indian doctors. There's been a lot of white doctors. There's been a lot of physicians who have had experience treating African Americans, but they have not been African Americans. Now we're starting to see that change a little, especially with some of the physicians that we have here in the Commonwealth. But that's an issue,
It's a huge problem. I think the last stat I saw was like there's 5% of the physicians in the United States are African American. Well, we're 12, 13, maybe 15% of the population. I mean, we have black colleges, we have medical schools, we have people who are going to majority white schools.
Yeah.
I mean, so clearly we can compete in any arena, and the black schools are certainly not inferior. So you have to wonder what is going on. And again, if you don't have people who are actually intimately familiar with your community and share that concern, then you're going to run into and you're going to see these disparities. So you've got all these studies coming out with doctors treating African Americans but having such devastating misconceptions about African American people, like things like our level of pain tolerance is higher, so we end up getting different prescriptions for things that other patients would need and would be adequate to achieve better health. So absolutely, we need more doctors. So in these listeners, young people who are listening, we need more people going into professions such as health, other professions where our people are, because we need more people who understand who we are. And then we need people of other cultures to make those extra steps, those
right.
extra leaps to understand our culture. Just like just to function in this country, have to understand other cultures and be able to behave appropriately. But it seems like for African Americans, again, that standard is somehow not needed. It's like you believe you can just treat us in our community without really understanding. Right. You don't really have to understand us, and if we don't respond to the treatment, then somehow it's our fault. No, it's your fault that you haven't taken the extra step as a servant to understand who you are serving. That's where it's at.
Absolutely. And you mentioned more black doctors, and I want to give a shout out to our HBCU medical schools that have been standing tall for decades and really not getting the recognition. Meharry, in Tennessee, Howard University School of Medicine in D.C., and the like. And now you have Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta. And a while back you had Xavier University also had a medical school before it closed down, but that was several decades back. So,
and now you got public health schools. I mean, you all are developing public health schools are vitally important too. They have different functions, but they're addressing the same issues.
Absolutely.
That's important too.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, it's a partnership between EVMS, ODU, and also Norfolk State University for a School of Public Health in order to get more African Americans into healthcare fields. Again, it's not so much to being a physician or being a surgeon, but it's also being a public health official, and oncologists, where we have also researchers and the like, because this is where behind the scenes, where we say the rubber meets the road, where you can really make a lot of change on the ground level, and then through execution, right? Through acting physicians, that's where we actually can give the hands-on care to people. So we're closing that gap, and as African Americans, we know about closing that gap. We know about exposing the gaps that's always been there. A lot of them man-made, if not all of them, in holding us back. But again, we shall rise, right?
And you made a very important point about different types of doctors fitting into this box of people of color, and so therefore they should be able to address this community. You've got people of color have a lot of diversity within them, and the fact of the subjugation of black people. The Black Lives Matter is a global movement.
Yeah.
So it's a global problem in India, in Pakistan, in China. So it's in all of these places. You got more black people down in South America than you have in North America who are suffering.
Absolutely.
So you can't just take a doctor who is coming out of that cultural context, right, where he's used to subjugating black people or she's used to subjugating black people, and then put them in front of a black patient and think that they're not going to act based in their cultural context. So we need doctors to understand who they're treating. And there are plenty of doctors who have taken that extra step. There are plenty of white doctors who have said, I'm going to respect my patient and I'm going to learn my patient regardless of what their background is. And I'm going to become culturally competent and treat them in a way that they need to be treated.
Absolutely.
And that's what we need. Take the extra step. And we also need more black doctors.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a minute left, and this has been intriguing for me, and I know our audience has loved it. But I want you to take the last few minutes to talk about our project that we have together, LaVeist and Claville.
Yes, absolutely. I'm enjoying it. Again, I remember we first connected when I was doing a radio show on the other side of the water, and I think the connection that we had and then the times that we enjoyed a Barbara Ham Lee's show.
Absolutely. Shout out to Barbara Ham Lee, Lisa
Shout out
Godley.
to Barbara and Lisa. We love them. And I just think that, we were always thinking in the back of our minds the opportunity came to talk about these issues that we both share and we both present them in the same way. And what we want to do is, as academics, as people have these extra letters after our names, is be able to talk about these complex issues in ways that everybody can understand. Because at the end of the day, we are both brothers. I'm from the northern hood, you from the southern hood.
That's right.
We have never forgotten where we come from, and we love our people, and we respect our people, whether they have all the extra degrees or not. So That's what LaVeist and Claville is all about, LaVeistandClaville.com. Check us out and blow it up.
And catch us on social media. Will, adding soul to the message. Is it the message or the messenger? Thank you so much for giving us that perspective about how we can communicate better to the African American community. If you don't mind, stick around with us for the second half hour as we wrap up Black History Month. This is Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. We'll be back in just a moment.
Blazing the Trails, a Black History Moment.
Bruce Bernard Smith is a former pro football player in Norfolk, Virginia, who was a defensive end for the Buffalo Bills and the Redskins of the NFL. He was part of the Bills team that played in 4 straight Super Bowls as AFC champions. In 2009, the record holder was included in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Smith was also inducted in the College Football Hall of Fame in 2006. During his victorious high school career, Smith earned an athletic scholarship to Virginia Tech. He was also known as the Sack Man as a Hokie and completed college in 1984 as the most honored player in Hokie history. The well-known player was drafted by the Bills with the first pick in the 1985 NFL Draft. He then became recognized as the sack specialist with 15 in 1986 and a personal season best 19, just 3 short of the then NFL record of 22. The NFL player, in marking his 52nd sack, had already become the Bills' all-time sack leader by 1989, declaring a team record that he was to increase 119 times over the years.
Blazing the Trails, a Black History Moment.
If you have a charity, foundation, or 501c3 organization, and you have an initiative that you would like to partner with Blazing Hot 91, send an email with the flyer to wnsbradio@nsu.edu. And don't forget to include the event name, the point of contact, the phone number, with the date and time and location of the event. Announcements are based on availability.
This is Stay in the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. Welcome. Thank you for joining us again on this Sunday as last Sunday of Black History Month. You know, if you joined us all Black History Month, you know that we've talked about the Black church and different aspects of it with our partnership with WNSB, Blazing Hot 91, in conjunction with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and also PBS and WHRO. And today we're going to talk about Black History Month itself. Now, we've heard Black History Month. We've grown up with it for those of you who are 70s babies, 60s babies, and the like. But I want to kind of go into the reason why we should. Should we continue to celebrate Black History Month? Why should we celebrate Black History Month? And also, how can we expand Black history itself? Again, but I want to thank you again for joining us, and we have a special guest today with us. Is a good friend of mine, Dr. Will LaVeist. Will, thank you again for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Claville. Always a pleasure, man.
You know, Will was on the show in the first half hour where we discussed adding soul to the message and discussing, you know, how have we missed the mark, you know, in talking about healthcare to African Americans? And he's back again here to join us as we talk about Black History Month. Will, you know, when was the first time that you remember in school or in church or the community a Black History Month program?
Yeah, I think actually it was I first became aware of Black History Month from my parents, who were very much stalwarts of Black history, particularly my mom, you know, being an a Pan-Africanist. My father was very much stressful in education. So I can first remember it being talked about in the home, but then, you know, I think the actual program probably occurred at school, and it was probably something about Frederick Douglass and, you know, Harriet Tubman and maybe Booker T and Martin Luther King. That was it. And that was it, you know, and that was essentially it. You know, that was a wrap for Black history. But obviously, you know, we've since learned that Black history, you know, predates, you know, Africans arriving on these shores, so it goes much deeper than that. And I thank God for Carter G. Woodson.
Absolutely.
You know, one of my heroes, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, for establishing Negro History Week, which expanded to Black History Month that we know as today.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking 1926. Carter G. Woodson, the Harvard-trained historian, you know, who was really a visionary, you know, and, Absolutely. You know, again, him, W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, other great thinkers of yesteryear, Frederick Douglass. And
a little-known Black history fact is that Carter G. Woodson actually went to Lincoln University for about a semester, and then he left, and I'm not sure why he did, but he was at Lincoln for about a semester, and went on and then earned his Ph.D., absolutely.
And look, the reason why Will mentions Lincoln University, because he is a proud graduate of Lincoln University. They're currently running for a position on the board there. So a man who loves his institution, just like here, you know, we love Norfolk State University, where WNSB is. but again, a visionary in 1926. And what people don't realize is that, like you said, it started out as Negro History Week to coincide with the birthdays of two figures that are tremendous in African American experience, who are, of course,
President Lincoln, and then also Frederick Douglass.
Absolutely. I believe that I know we look at people who are out front, right, and they get the notoriety and the like, but in my time, I found that the most influential people many times are the people you don't even know about that are talking to those who have the power, right, the power to move the needle. And Frederick Douglass was definitely one of those individuals to move the needle. He was one of the main advisors to Abraham Lincoln, during that time period. And of course, we know Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass played a major part in the abolishing slavery, in galvanizing the Union, African-American soldiers serving in the military. Frederick Douglass was a big proponent of that, to show, quote unquote, that the Negro, of course known as African Americans today, but the Negro loved his country, even though, again, that was to show it, but we know we did because we built it, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Frederick Douglass is one of our Jeremiahs, his famous 4th of July speech, continues to resonate today. So you're right. I mean, he was critical and one of the, he's among one of the founding fathers of this nation, literally, because of his push for liberation and to push the nation to actually be what it had promised it would be, a nation for all people, freedom, justice for all.
Absolutely. And then, we went from Negro History Week because, well, first of all, again, the reason why Carter G. Woodson created it is because he felt that America itself really did not understand the contributions of African Americans or the Negro to America. So it was to educate America and the world, okay, because he was also a visionary of the world citizen in understanding how African Americans and the Black experience really impacted the world, because America impacted the world at that time. So, and it was not only to educate America, educate the world, but also bring into remembrance of African American or the Negro at that time, the benefits, the contributions of great people of African descent.
Right, and to show the resilience and greatness and intelligence and faithfulness, godly faithfulness of a people, to be able to point out that we, of anyone, have undergone a tremendous attack in this country. Our indigenous brothers and sisters obviously, suffered a great sacrifice for this country to be built, and we as enslaved people suffered a tremendous sacrifice for this nation to be built. So to ignore, these peoples and these sacrifices that happen is at the detriment of the nation.
Absolutely.
Itself, and our culture, African Americans, what we were able to do, what our ancestors were able to do, is a term called Neoculturation, where you take different pieces and parts of other cultures, combine with your own, and create a new cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so that's what we were doing. That's what we did. Our music is original American music. Soul food
is original.
Is original to American. This is a delicacy. This is a food that has been developed from influences from indigenous, from African, from Europe, and it was the Black servants of people like Jefferson and Washington. I believe it was a chef called Hercules who was the first celebrity chef. Well, he was a Black man.
Yeah.
So, and he was creating original American cuisine.
In other words, people came for his food, not just so much for the meetings or a guest at his house, but for the food that he was cooking, because they heard about this guy.
Right, and he's creating it by combining these different cultural influences and making it original American cuisine. So this is what our culture has done throughout. You see that permeating throughout many ways, many arenas, and this is why black people, I believe we had it right when we said Afro-American people.
Right. Because
the people of Africa, the Middle Passage descendants, this is what we have been, why we're so important to this nation.
Absolutely. And then you talk about food. I just want to throw this in there. Not only were we creating these dishes, but we were creating it without formal, quote unquote, formal training, right? We were taking a little bit here, a little bit there, and going, through our God-given creativity and ingenuity. A lot of, the Creole cuisine of Louisiana is just that, where Africans took French and Spanish and African spices, and they combined it all together and created these phenomenal dishes that people fly in from all over the world just to have a little gumbo, a little etouffee, a little po' boy, little red beans and rice.
We getting hungry. And then the interesting thing is that, as you mentioned, those dishes, right? For example, because food is a very good way of being able to trace a people's culture and see similarities.
Absolutely.
Well, you talk about red beans and rice. Well, you go down to the Caribbean, you're going to see some of that, right?
Rice and peas.
That's right. You go into the deep south. You go into Alabama. You go to the northwest. You're going to see these similarities within our culture and that's one of the things that's powerful about our culture also, is that it's very portable because we've been able to adapt different cultures. A lot of times when people are exposed to us, right, they see parts of their culture in us,
in our culture. Exactly,
and it resonates with them.
Absolutely.
So this is why, for example, the most recent example that we have of that is hip hop. The ability to be able to remix and take and match and to take things and flip it around and make it fresh and new. That is uniquely African American, and that's why that particular cultural artifact, art form, has been so powerful and has traveled so far and wide.
Absolutely. You listen to State of the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. Today, we are talking with Dr. Will LaVeist as we talk about Black History Month on this last day in February. We talk about the importance of Black History Month, why we should still celebrate it, and what we can learn about it. 757-823-9110, 757-823-9110. Let us know your thoughts about when you first started celebrating, your first memory of Black History Month, and the importance of Black History Month to you. Now, Will, we just started talking about Negro History Week, created by Carter G. Woodson, but it turned into Black History Month under President Gerald Ford in 1876. And I know a lot of times we attach Gerald Ford, of course, to taking over for Richard Nixon and the pardon of Richard Nixon and the like. But there were some good things that Gerald Ford did do outside of what we perceive to be negative on his resume. And one of those things was creating and signing a bill to have February as Black History Month. And I want to give a quote here that he stated, which I think is so important even to this day. He said, the country needed to seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. I think that still resonates today. And I think it goes, and it will, I think it goes to the very heart and the nature of why Carter G. Woodson created, Negro History Week within itself.
Yeah, I mean, he how can you say it much clearer, and also the fact that, a big part of American culture is these contradictions. I mean, if you've been to the Museum of African American History, you see the story. I mean, I would tell anyone, please go there, because not only will you get an understanding of our culture, but you're going to understand our country. And our country is just full of contradictions in leadership, but yet and still, but in spite of, we continue to progress on. So like you said, you look at a Gerald Ford, and he's not typically associated with doing anything positive for African American history.
Right.
But we'll turn to Bill Clinton. We say, oh, he was actually the first Black president before we had a first Black president. Yet his policies were extremely
detrimental, absolutely
detrimental to the Black community, particularly if you compare them to Ford's, right? So this one of the things about us as a people, we've been uniquely positioned because of the oppression to actually be able to put a mirror in front of America to see itself, to see its contradictions, and to maybe strive to become a better nation. But America continues to be a country of a lot of contradictions. So people who you would have thought, were just a loss and just totally anti-black, you find, no, they actually weren't. And some of the people that you think were so pro-black, well, actually weren't, and that's why understanding history is so important.
Absolutely. Now, some people believe, of course, you're always going to have naysayers. You have proponents and opponents. That is human nature, right? So, but I believe the important thing is to agree to disagree. So let's get to it. There's some people believe that Black History Month is not needed at all because it ignores, and matter of fact, I've heard this when I was in school, and I still hear it from adults. Individuals say, why do we have Black History Month? It's racist because we don't have a White History Month. And you're right. You give yourself a little pause. And then, I would ask, how many pages? I said, go to your history book, 5th grade, 8th grade, 12th grade, and go through it and tell me how many pages that you see of African-American contribution to the American experience, right? So for the most part, if you got a 500-page history book, maybe 50 pages at the most, and I'm being very generous, I'm including the glossary and the index and all that, is actually committed to the African-American experience. I mean, so what would you say to those individuals that say we don't need Black History Month because it excludes White History Month?
Well, I say that's that all lives matters mentality. When the Black Lives Matter movement erupted, people are so quick to knee-jerk and say, well, all lives matter. And you're not understanding that what you're doing is you're denying the fact that here's a group of people who have been marginalized. And what we're saying is, no, we matter too. Langston Hughes wrote the poem, I too sing America.
Right.
We're saying we matter too. So when you keep saying, no, everybody matters, what you're doing is you're denying that this group has been marginalized. So that's what I say to people, is that for you to say, well, we don't need Black history because you don't have a White History Month, is because all of the months are White History Months. As you just said, you look at the textbooks. The textbooks are written from a white perspective on history. The textbooks don't show the indigenous people's perspective as it pertains to these same events. It's not showing the African Americans' perspective or the others who have been involved. The history that we see is from that mindset of, well, the victor claims the spoils. The victor gets to tell the narrative. So when we get, I like the saying that I've seen out there that, all lives matter when Black lives matter. That's the mindset we need to have when we truly have a level playing field that people like Martin Luther King fought for. Then, you maybe you can say at that point that you won't need a Black History Month. But as long as you are still not fully aware of the contributions that people have made, the important contributions, obviously we need it.
Yeah, and it kind of segue into my next point where, when we talk about Black History Month and the need for it, I think we do still need it. It's obvious until our history reflects all of the experiences of Africans in America. And when I say all of the experience, I mean the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? Because a lot of our experiences have been at the hands of the white establishment or the government, if people want to call it that, limiting the advancement of African Americans or people of Afro descent into advancing into society. I mean, so we've got to include Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? I mean, as a matter of fact, we've had now, like you said, COVID's unveiled a lot of things, and it's also unveiled and how history has been hidden purposefully, from society. So, Tulsa was a terrible, terrible time in our nation and in Tulsa itself. But we got to tell that story, right? We still got to tell the story of forced, the Tuskegee experiment, which we do. But we also have to tell the story of forced sterilization in the Mississippi Delta, which Fannie Lou Hamer was a part of. right? We got to tell the story of HeLa cells, right? Of research and science taking cells out of her body without her people's consent and still using it today, and making money off of it, right? So AIDS research, all types of research has been done off of this black woman's body that nobody had permission to take. But it's not just those terrible stories of the bad history which came up on us, but the great history. I know a lot of times we look at inventions, the street light and so forth, and the stop sign, and we just take it for granted. But we don't tell the story of how African Americans were involved in creating these instruments and mechanisms, all the way from the plantation all the way up to technology. African Americans have been the forefront of that.
Yeah, we have an African American that just recently went in space. So Black History Month allows this time, to be able to focus and say, wait a minute, just take a break and look at the greatness of black culture and how it's permeating. And I think, as you said, the more that we can have that kind of equality, that equal opportunity to tell your story to be permeated throughout the year, then you'll have less of a need for it. But why would you feel that there should be less of a need for it? To me, someone who's talking that way is saying, well, maybe they're saying this is not something that they want to learn about. Maybe they're saying this is not something they want to be exposed to. Because me, as an American, as a member of the human family, I'm curious about all kinds of different people and cultures and want to know and respect them. So anybody who's saying, you don't need it at this point and we don't have a White History Month, the unstated message that they're delivering is, I'm not interested in learning about you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I want to take a look at this article that was written by Jamar Tisby of The Witness, witness.bcc.com, and he talks about 5 reasons we should celebrate Black history still. And I want to throw these out there to you and give me your thoughts about it, Will. He says we should celebrate Black history because, one, it celebrates and honors the historic leaders of the Black community. He says doing this allows us to take a pause and remember their stories so we can commemorate their achievements.
Oh, I agree. The leaders are who inspire you to see what it is that you've been called to do and what you can do. And a lot of times when you learn the stories of these leaders, you find out that they really came from beginnings that were much like your own.
Yeah.
And so they have more in common with you than you may think. And these leaders, like I'm recalling right now, a time I had to interview the late John Lewis and spend time with him when I had my radio show.
Also your fraternity brother, right?
Yeah, also Phi Beta Sigma fraternity brother. And in his presence and learning his story, he made me feel like he was honored to be with me. And I left him feeling like, hey, I got more to do. I'm not doing enough. I gotta get going. So when you learn about the leaders, they inspire you to see what it is that you can do. I just saw the movie about Billie Holiday that is out now. Powerful movie that shows you how much of a fighter and a resilient woman that she was. We're used to seeing Billie as a tragic figure,
story.
Absolutely. Miss Holiday. But in that movie, you see about how powerful, about how strong, about how steadfast she was to her art and to her people. So these stories are very important.
Yeah, and that story is told by Lee Daniels, who directed that. And we see how we're telling stories from our perspective, and which is very important because we see it through 2 different lenses, which is why, again, I believe African American history or Black History Month itself is so very important. We should celebrate it every single day. Also, Jamar writes, he says, celebrating us, it helps us to be a better steward of the privileges that we've gained. And, and Will, my comment to that is when I look at the 50s and 60s and I grew up, 70s and 80s, and my neighborhood, African American neighborhood, we had, Black businessmen. African and Black men owned the gas station, barbershops, beauty shops, insurance company, black lawyer, law office, of course, the repair shop. We had the daycare in the community. And everywhere we went, funeral homes, insurance companies, we went, we did a lot of business with black business because that's where we live. And we saw black men and women carry themselves in a way and I'll just say a way of importance, right? Because and we looked upon them and said, I want to be like that. And, sometimes I scratch my head, and I see how, drugs were poured into our communities and have decimated them. And now
break all that down, yeah.
And it breaks all it down. And it really comes and it breaks my heart. But I know that if we understand our history, we can better build ourselves up again, right? Build back black communities better. And I took that little piece from Joe Biden's infrastructure bill, Build Back America Better, right? So we could build Black America back better if we understand our history.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, especially now because now that the economy is open to us in ways that it was not open to us then because of segregation. Now we have the opportunity to be able to produce product and sell it to the world.
Yeah.
So if we can
Absolutely.
understand our tradition of entrepreneurship that we come from and say, okay, now we have more opportunities than those brothers and sisters had, that we had more opportunity than Madam C.J. Walker had, who became the first woman millionaire, right? We now have a more multicultural, more global market that we can sell to. So why not be inspired and get moving and get going? Absolutely.
And when you open up your eyes, and we talked about hip hop earlier, like I saw a documentary where it showed hip hop around the world. Hip hop has touched every single country in the world. From the South Korean, Asian movement. I saw a rap group in Iran. I told
you. You remember I tell the story about being in Mongolia and you cats playing hip hop. I'm walking in the street in Mongolia and they cats playing hip hop and jumped out the car and took a picture with me. I mean, but go ahead, yeah.
And I was watching a documentary again also about I think it was actually Nelson Mandela, and they were going through a shanty town, and you saw the name Biggie and Tupac written on a shanty house, right? In the shanty town. I'm saying, wait a minute, did I just see that? But it tells you how the influence of black Americans, again, going back, and as you said, how African-American culture influences everything. Another thing, Will, and we're running out of time, but celebrating Black history provides us an opportunity, I believe, to highlight our best and brightest of Black history and culture because so many times we're displayed in a negative light. Also, it helps us to create awareness of our people and remind us, I think the most important, that Black history is our history. It's American history.
Amen. Amen. And that's why what you're doing with your show, and you mentioned Lee Daniels and other filmmakers, other artists, is so important to be true to that part of the art, to show our best and our brightest and to inspire us, inspire the world.
Well, look, I've loved this time with you, and of course, we spent a lot of time together. Very quickly, we're in our last 60 seconds of the show. Tell our audience where they can learn more about our project and what we do.
LaVeistandClaville.com, LaVeistandClaville.com, our podcast where we join forces to talk about the issues that are most important to our community in a way that everybody can understand it and break it down and actually be empowered to make change. And
That's
also
right.
On social media, man.
Yeah, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, at LaVeist and Claville. You can find Black history every single day, 365. We highlight our treasures of Black history at LaVeist and Claville. Dr. Will LaVeist, thank you so much for joining us here on State of the Water. And for those of you that want to catch us, you can go on our YouTube page and catch us at WNSB Blazing Hot 91, and you can view our State of the Water right there. And we'll see you on next week as we bring policymakers, movers and shakers to you, the community, to talk about it the way that you want. Until then, we'll see you next time.